think it's interesting because Shakespeare was born into that belief system, but yet he wrote in ways that challenged that belief system, and he used comedy to do it, which is why it's so interesting to me.
Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining me on the Gift of Need podcast. I'm Jude DiMeglio Trang, and I'm an author and I'm an observer of human need in society. And this podcast seeks to address the overlooked power of need and how it shapes our behavior, our relationships, and society as a whole. And I hope to whet your appetite and get you thinking about your needs and how they're not burdens, but opportunities and gifts. And I do that with amazing guests with a variety of backgrounds and talents, like my guest today, who is Kim Bradley. We're going to be talking about why we need laughter and comedy in our lives. So, hi, Kim.
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm so excited to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is Shakespeare.
And the guy you share a birthday with, of all things. Oh. Well, Kim is a woman of many talents and interests. She's been a pretzel maker, a foreign language teacher, a musician, a songwriter, a librarian, a farm worker, oh my gosh, a Duke cheerleader, genetic researcher, employee benefits lawyer, and legal treaty advisor. She is a mom of twins. That's probably the most incredible job. She is here today as an author as we discuss her new book, Shakespeare's Guide to Living the Good Life. So, Kim, can you start by telling us a little bit about this very interesting background?
Sure. Yeah, I started working in the pretzel shop when I was 14, so that's why I put pretzel maker on my bio. But long before that, I was just one of those kids that loved books and words and puzzles and languages and anything that had to do with putting pen to paper. So I also had this interest in science. At Duke, I thought I was going to be a molecular biologist, and I was still going to have my English degree because I loved English. But then I worked in the genetics lab, and back then you had to wear this badge that if you went into the radiation room in the genetics lab and your badge got filled with radiation, you were done. I was like, you know what? This job's kind of dangerous. I think I'm gonna just go toward the other direction. So that's how I became an employee benefits attorney with an English degree. And then I guess a few decades later, after practicing law, I came back to my love of writing and my love of Shakespeare. And here we are.
Here you are. Well, today we're going to be discussing our need for laughter and comedy and how Shakespeare's comedies can enrich our lives. So, Kim, would you give us a brief background on the Elizabethan worldview, the one that Shakespeare was raised in and produced his works in, and that described in a few words as the great chain of being and cosmic order, where God was on the top and below him angels, then humans. Of course, men were above women in those humans, animals, plants, and then inanimate matter. So give us a little bit about this.
Yeah, that was the source of a lot of the comedy, I think, and part of Shakespeare too. But Elizabethans thought that everything followed that order, and they thought that it was the perfect order. It had a purpose. And if you disrupted any part of that order, it could destabilize the cosmos. I mean, they really felt very strongly that everything was connected and you did not buck the system. That was the way they lived. And saying that it's rigid, but also they were believers in astrology. There are lots of quotes in Shakespeare about the wandering stars and the sun and the moon, and the effect that the stars and the sun and the moon had on humans and plants and animals. They believed in fairies, like, Puck from A Midsummer Night's Dream, and sprites like Ariel from The Tempest. But they also had a very strong religious part of their society too. They thought all of that worked together just fine, but one of the things that's interesting, and you'll see it in Shakespeare's works, like Macbeth is a good example of this. If you disturb one thing, like Macbeth killing Duncan, it causes all other disturbances in other part of the world, like natural disasters, and the sun doesn't rise and storms come up and the horses go mad. So they really did believe that wasn't a superstition. They believed that that was the case. And I think it's interesting because Shakespeare was born into that belief system, but yet he wrote in ways that challenged that belief system, and he used comedy to do it, which is why it's so interesting to me.
So that's exactly right. And he demonstrated the struggles that Elizabethan people may have had with some of the emerging conflicts, okay, of the ideas of their time, the older ideas and superstitions, and or even like the place of women in society, right? Especially with Queen Elizabeth not marrying, because even though she was a queen, if she'd married, she would have been subject to laws related to her husband's authority and property rights and all of this stuff. So, that's, go a little bit further into that.
Yeah, I think The Merchant of Venice is a really good example of that, the struggles of women, particularly in society. And Portia is the heroine in The Merchant of Venice, and her wealthy father dies. And instead of leaving her his estate, which we would think would be, the normal way that it would happen, he writes in his will that she has to marry whoever shows up and correctly chooses from a trio of 3 treasure chests. One's gold, one's silver, and one's lead. And so when the suitors line up to take their shot at their treasure, we see them being really foolish. And then we see how brilliant and reserved Portia is. She has to work within this system, but she's smarter than everybody else. So the suitors are blindly following the convention and just going along with how everything is supposed to work. But Shakespeare roasts them, and it's some of the best comedy in The Merchant of Venice. He roasts these suitors of Portia. So the audience is laughing because they're so funny when they pick the gold casket and all that glisters is not gold. And the guy who picks the silver casket says, wait, I see a picture of a blinking idiot. Those are some of the laughs that come from The Merchant of Venice. But we also a sigh of relief for Portia, whew, she got out of that one, so that's the fun of the comedy. He's talking about the struggles, particularly of women, but he's also making it somewhat lighthearted.
Yeah. In my just completed book, not published yet, The Gift of Need, I discuss our human need for comic exposure, making fun of and mimicking philosophers and political leaders. That's an enduring, eternal source of fodder for humor. But I realize there are 2 different types of humor. One is laughing with each other. Another is laughing at others. And I love this. W.H. Auden, who was an English-American poet, gave a lecture in 1946 in New York on Shakespeare. And I'm going to read this. In specific, he spoke about the difference between Greek classical comedy and Shakespeare's comedy. And he said, in Greek classical comedy, the comedy ends with the audience laughing and the characters on stage in tears. But in Shakespeare's comedies, like Much Ado About Nothing, it ends with everybody laughing, both on stage and in the audience. Why, he asks. And he puts it down to the difference in worldviews, how Greek society viewed humans as opposed to Shakespeare. Greek society valued sophistication and wisdom and believing that individuals had, differing value and worth, actually, which determined their rank in society, which was very rigid. The humor in their plays was used as a way of putting people down so that others could feel superior to those deemed less than. Boy, does that sound common, right? So yeah. Do you think that's why the Bard's plays have had such lasting and broad appeal? Because he tapped into our self-knowledge that when we're being honest with ourselves, right? We must admit that we are undeniably prone to missteps and mistakes, just like everyone else.
Oh, 100%. I think the genius of Shakespeare in that regard is that the funniest, the most endearing, the wisest characters that he wrote were the ones that were considered on the low end of the Elizabethan hierarchy. The
Exactly.
Yeah, the jesters. Often he wrote about orphans and especially the women. He gave the women in his plays the best jokes. On stage, they got the most laughs, and he showed that it was not only acceptable, but it was therapeutic for us to laugh at ourselves and laugh together.
Yeah, there are. I think about Much Ado About Nothing. We've watched that video with Emma Thompson and Kevin Branagh, Kenneth Branagh, excuse me. And I think about with the sheriff and his guys. And I forget the actor's name. Do you remember who it was? Who was the sheriff?
It was Michael Keaton, played Dogberry.
Oh my gosh, that scene is hilarious, and it's just it just makes you roar. So, what I'd like to think about is how comic exposure and good laughter actually benefits not just our minds and our souls, but also our physical being. A joyful heart is good medicine is a proverb from King Solomon 3,000 years ago. But of course, nobody had any scientific evidence for that to prove his point. But we know it's true. It's scientifically sound. Laughter is strong and healing. It's contagious. It affects our physical and mental health. I have a few points that I brought out in the book. So laughter relaxes the whole body, with our muscles staying relaxed for up to 45 minutes. I need to laugh more, clearly. It boosts the immune system by decreasing stress hormones. It increases immune cells and antibodies. Laughter triggers the relief of endorphins, the feel-good hormones, to promote overall sense of well-being, and it can even temporarily relieve pain. It increases blood flow, good for our heart. It may help us live longer. It certainly adds joy to our lives, and relieves stress. And it keeps distressing emotions at bay, which shifts our perspective, which, again, I have a husband who has a great sense of humor, not stand-up humor, but he sees the humor in things that I'm so serious sometimes. It's like, oh my gosh. And then it makes me laugh. And that's why I married this man, right? So the title of your book is Shakespeare's Guide to Living the Good Life. And you discuss many of Shakespeare's comedies and how, quote, he allowed himself to feel all the feels and then used his singular talents to express his point of view through a medium he loved, and that his deep dive into the human condition and his passion for sharing his insights with the world have enriched our lives in so many practical ways. And I love that because in each chapter, you summarize a play and its context and then focus on a theme related to the good life. And I really appreciate the summarizing the play because even though I've seen a lot of them, I get them mixed up. I get the names and the characters mixed up. So I really enjoyed that. Great summaries that you did. Would you share a few of them and the themes of the good life that you brought out in your book?
Sure. I think just like you mentioned about laughter, I couldn't agree more with the science of laughter. And, I incorporate a little bit of that into my book as well, because it really is something that we in the 21st century have in common with the people who were Shakespeare's audience, even though they lived 400 years ago. And I think when I was writing the book, it just struck me, like being a lifelong fan of Shakespeare, how similar the challenges were that his audience had to what we are facing: natural disasters, political unrest, the plague. Except we have modern medicine, so we can sort of deal with that. But they didn't know anything about germ theory or anything like that. So the plague lasted for hundreds of years for them, and it was really scary because they didn't know what to do about it, and it was deadly. people were discriminated against at that time. There was environmental degradation at that time. So that audience had a lot of the same challenges that we have. So what Shakespeare did, and what why I wrote the book really was he got together with his friends. His theater troupe was his best friends. Like that, that's who he was with day in, day out. They didn't have like paper to memorize, to write their lines down and walk around with the script. Like they had to memorize the lines, and they were, writing plays and performing plays like every couple of weeks. I can't imagine how they kept that all in their head, but they had this little community, and what they did was create art and share laughter with the audiences that came to see their plays. So he was feeding his soul, following his passion, along with his fellow actors and writers, and he was uplifting the audience at the same time. So I see that as a guide for us today. Like he kind of did it. We get to read what he wrote, and we get to see the wonderful performances of the plays. And then we can sort of apply those same themes to our lives. So the Comedy of Errors is the first chapter that I have in the book. And it's one of his earliest plays. It's super silly. It's sort of Punch and Judy style. Two sets of identical twins. They have the same name. The twins, each set of twins is named the same.
Which is totally confusing to me. It's like, I'm going, oh, okay, now who is this now? And,
Right. Antipholus from Ephesus, Antipholus from Syracuse, Dromio from Ephesus, Dromio from Syracuse. Right. It's so confusing. But their families together in a shipwreck when they're children, and they're separated from their family. And then they find each other 20 years later. So in the beginning, it's a tale about human emotions like separation, grief, isolation. Of course, mistaken identities, because Shakespeare loves mistaken identities. And
he really does, doesn't he? He really does.
He does. But ultimately, it's about family and reunion and the joy of gathering with your loved ones. So that's why the theme that I chose for the Comedy of Errors chapter was hospitality. That's where that play is the quote that says, "Small cheer and great welcome makes a merry feast." And Shakespeare's highlighting the importance of generosity, love, laughter, and being together in community, saying that the welcome is more important. Welcome represents goodwill in the Comedy of Errors. So the goodwill and the welcoming and the generosity is much more important than having the immaculate tablescape or ordering the most expensive food, which is the cheer. And that's why it says great welcome and small cheer makes a merry feast. So, in the hospitality chapter also, and all the chapters, I put these little historical Shakespeare trivia tidbits in there because I was a researcher, so I like to dig in and find out what was going on in the mind of the author and the playwright.
I loved those. I really loved those. I thought that was just great.
Yeah, people say Shakespeare's a mystery, and there's, all these sort of like conspiracy theories about who Shakespeare was. But there's actually like maybe now, like in the last 10 years, there's a fair amount of information that you can find about him to find out what was going on in his life. And so I talk about what was going on in his life, and then I have enactments at the end of each chapter to allow the reader to bring that theme into their own life. So the hospitality, one of my favorite enactments from the hospitality chapter is the Happy Memory Jar game, which I don't know. Have you ever played the Happy Memory Jar game?
No, but I loved it. I love that idea.
Yeah, it's fun. You have a gathering, family, friends, coworkers, neighbors. It can be anyone. And you put out a mason jar, some pens and slips of paper. You ask everyone to write down a few of their favorite memories. And it can be about like the event. It can be about the neighborhood. It can just be about each other, and put them in the jar anonymously. When everybody's contributed, you get in a circle and you just pass the jar around, and each person just picks up a random slip and then reads the memory. And then you try to figure out like, who wrote that? Who focused on that? It's funny things like, remember we laughed so hard that milk came out of your nose? Or remember when grandma sat on the dog? And, just all kinds of like funny things. And it creates laughter, and it shows you the value of gathering and the value of hospitality. So that's kind of the gist of each of the chapters.
Why don't you give us maybe Much Ado About Nothing, and just a little bit of brief summary of the play and and some of the comedy and that kind of, whatever you would like to share about it.
Yeah, I think that's a good one too. For that chapter, the theme is communication, authentic communication. And what's interesting about like the plot is that they're soldiers coming back from war. So they're wearing a bunch of armor. And then as the play goes on, they're sort of like in this village where in Messina, where they're resting after the war, and they're kind of like learning how to get back into society. So they're like physically taking off their armor. But the beauty of Shakespeare is that he's showing that in the beginning, nobody wants to tell the truth about what's going on, like Beatrice and Benedict and the enemies to lovers plot line, and Don John, like actually hating his brother, Don Pedro, who were, on opposite sides of the battle. But as it's peeled back, like the onion is peeled back, you see the authentic communication come through. And that's where you get the resolution to the play. Like that's where you get the happy ending to the comedy. But I did write one of the funniest quotes, because Benedict and Beatrice are hilarious. And just like you said, in the Kenneth Branagh and Emma Thompson version, they were married at the time. So like they were playing, the enemies to lovers couple while they were married. They were, they're both great actors. So it was so good. But there's one scene where, Don Pedro is asking Benedict to like go talk to Beatrice. Like, she's right there. Like, go, why don't you go talk to her? And Benedict says, will your grace command me any service to the world's end? I'll go on the slightest errand. Now to the Antipodes. You can devise, send me. I'll fetch you a toothpicker now from the furthest inch of Asia. I will bring you the length of Prester John's foot, fetch you a hair off the great Cham's beard. I will do you any embassage to the pygmies rather than hold 3 words conference with this harpy. Like, he's going off like, I will do anything, just don't make me talk to her. And it's just really funny because they show you in the beginning of the play that they actually did have this little tryst, and then it kind of, they had a falling out. So that's part of the comedy is, ha ha ha. They're saying one thing, they really mean something else, and it's very funny.
Oh boy. And then so in focusing on communication in your enactment, then you've got things to help people like think about how they might use this in a way to work through communication. Honest communication, I guess, is what the focus is, right?
Yes, yeah. And that's similar to the happy memory jar. I, because I like Shakespeare, I like to play with words. I called it a score of lively interrogatives, because that's iambic pentameter, a score of lively interrogatives. And it's basically 20 questions. So it's kind of like have a person be it at your next gathering and let them think of something. And then everybody else in the room has to guess, but ask questions. So you can only ask up to 20 questions. And the only answers can be yes or no. So it's a way to be creative. Like the more imaginative you are with your questions, the closer you might be to solving or guessing what the person has chosen. It reminded me of that 1940s radio show where somebody said in the 20 questions game, is it bigger than a bread box? And even that is funny. Like, that's like a famous question. Is what you're thinking of bigger than a bread box?
That's funny. Well, gosh, we could go on. There are so many things about Shakespeare and comedy and laughter that just, again, I think our need for joy and our need for kind humor and laughter and and laughing with others instead of laughing at others, which we're going to talk about in another podcast. I think that's so important. I also want to let our listeners know, just tell us a little bit about your historical fiction series, The Merchant Tides, and maybe we'll do another podcast about them too, but just whet our appetite.
Oh, yeah. It's totally different. It's historical fiction. It has a lot of ancient Greek mysticism. So it's interesting that you were talking about W.H. Auden and the Greek tragedies and the Greek comedies, because I have a little bit of that in my historical fiction. It's sort of a Mediterranean saga right now. I've written the first 3 books of a 5-book series. The first book is set in Greece on the island of Chios. The second book is set in Smyrna, which is current day Izmir in Turkey. And the third book is set in Minorca. And it is a coming of age historical adventure based on the true story of the Greeks and Minorcans who settled in St. Augustine, Florida, which is where I live.
Oh my goodness. Oh, well, that should be really interesting. And what's the age target for that series?
It's written as an adult series, but it's clean. So I have a lot of younger readers. I have a lot of like middle school, high school readers, which is interesting because that's not what I intended. But I guess, I love Lord of the Rings. I love Watership Down is one of my favorite books of all time that I read when I was a child. So I think I just wrote in the style of books that I loved when I was that age. And so that's how they ended up. I have adult people, my parents, and their friends, they love them. I've got high school kids that love them. So it's kind of like for any age.
Any age. Okay. Young adult on up. So, well, thank you, Kim. Thank you so much, for making the time to be with us today and talk about how the needs that we all have for laughter and comedy can become opportunities and gifts for creatives like Shakespeare and his company to meet those needs, right? They're looking for an outlet for their talents. And then our needs are fulfilled when they use their talents and training to serve us with that creativity. And so it just brings joy and fulfillment to us all, which is the point of what I'm trying to make with the gift of need, is that, looking at our needs instead of as burdens, to see ways in which they're an opportunity for others to step in and help. And as they help us, they feel fulfilled and we are fulfilled also. So, thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate so much you having me on your podcast. And it's been really fun to talk about laughter and comedy and joy.
Yeah.
And Shakespeare.
And Shakespeare, of course. So, all right. Well, you can get your copies of Shakespeare's Guide to Living the Good Life and check out Kim's work by going to kim-bradley.com, and that will be in the show notes so that you get the right website. The great music you're hearing was written and performed by Gabe Kubanda at Kubanda Music. You can reach and find him on any streaming service and social media. The engineer is Ray Ingenieri of Third Street Productions here in Tucson, Arizona. Please consider following and subscribing to this podcast and my free Substack newsletter. And leave a comment or review. I'd love to hear from you. I'll pass on any comments you might have to Kim, and I'd love to hear from anybody. Bye.